So we have looked at how we remember stuff and how our brain accesses that information when we are remembering, but now we need to look at forgetting. So there's two theories of forgetting. There's a theory of interference and there's a theory of retrieval failure. So information getting muddled up and then information not being able to be accessed. The first theory comes from the idea that we do sometimes forget stuff. So we don't always remember everything. Psychologists have tried to explain why we cannot remember everything. So the multi-store model is suggesting that long-term memory has an unlimited capacity, but we do forget information. And the researchers have tried to establish whether this is an issue with availability. So our memories, do they vanish? Do they go from our memories? Or is it accessibility? Is it just that we cannot reach them? So that's what the theories of forgetting try to look at. They try to look at whether forgetting is due to availability, is stuff not there anymore, or is forgetting due to accessibility? We just can't get to that information. It's there, but we have no way to get to it. The first theory is about interference. Interference is where memories get in the way of one another. So one memory can cause you to forget another memory. One memory can cause you to distort or change another memory. This is more likely if memories are similar. There are two types of interference. You have proactive interference, or PI, where previously learned information, old information, interferes with new information. So that's proactive interference. So old information is interfering with new information. And then you have retroactive interference, so RI, where new information interferes with old information. So proactive is old interfering with new. Retroactive is new interfering with old. Now, if you call your new girlfriend your old girlfriend's name, is that proactive or retroactive interference? So in this case, it's proactive interference. So old information is distorting new information. Now, if we go back here, you need to be able to describe what we mean by proactive and retroactive interference. That could be an exam question. But something that's also come up is to ask students to give an example of proactive and retroactive interference. So the name thing here is an example of proactive interference. I would make sure that in your notes you also have an example of retroactive interference in case you're asked for one in an exam. It has come up once before as a question. There is a study that supports the idea of interference. It's by Underwood and Postman. And they looked at learning words and they found that words can interfere recall of other words. So read the study. It does support the idea of interference. There is also a study by Bradley and Hitch on rugby players and rugby players forgetting information. I have no idea, by the way, why it's a picture of a football player on the rugby one. I apologise. I will change it. In terms of evaluating interference, most of the evidence comes from lab studies, which means they're controlled and they're reliable. So that's a strength. However, they're artificial. They lack mundane realism. You can argue they can't be generalised, but they do support the idea of interference. So there is kind of positives and negatives of the fact that evidence comes from lab studies. You could argue that a research into interference lacks motivation to remember. And you can Badley also argues that there is a lack of mundane realism in these tasks. They're not tasks that you would encounter in everyday life when you have to remember information or when you might get interference. So there's some AO3 points in here, and there's also some in your textbook and some in your booklet. The second theory of forgetting is about retrieval failure and about an absence of cues. This can be referred to as cue-dependent forgetting. This explains forgetting in terms of retrieval failure in that stuff is there, but it's a problem with accessibility. And forgetting is due to a lack of cues. It's a lack of information that will trigger a certain memory. It proposes that when we learn information, we also encode, or we also store the context and the state that we are in. So the context is external cues in which we learn the information, and the mental state we're in is kind of internal cues. And these things act as cues to recall. So we can remember the context of something, and we can remember what state that we are in. So the theory is that you can have context-dependent forgetting, so where you lack an external cue to access a memory, and state-dependent forgetting, where you lack an internal cue to access a memory. So there's some research on both of these. So in terms of context-dependent forgetting, the study that's good to use is by Godden and Baddeley, and it's on recall in divers. The information's there, it's in your booklet, it's in your textbook, but this is the research that you use to support the idea of context-dependent forgetting. So if you learn something in one environment, you are more likely to recall it better in the same environment. So if this theory is correct, then technically you should do all your A-level learning in the environment in which you will be asked to recall that information, so the exam hall. So that's context-dependent forgetting. So Godden and Baddeley study is the one that you should use for that. State-dependent forgetting is where you lack the internal cue to recall information. There are several studies in this. Kind of the two more popular ones is one where people are given antihistamines, so they're kind of sedated a bit, and they're asked to recall. And there's also a study by Goodwin, there's a typo in here, sorry, which looks at sober versus drunk recall. But state-dependent forgetting says that you need to be in the same internal state when you recall information as when you remembered it. So if we think about it in exams, when we do an exam, we're quite anxious. State-dependent forgetting would say that unless we're anxious when we learn stuff, we are not necessarily going to remember it if we're anxious in an exam. So if we're calm in an exam, we're more likely to have the internal cues to remember information that we learnt when we were also in a calm state. There's some AO3 on this. Again, it's in your textbook and in the booklet. There's research support for the importance of cues, so you can use Godden and Baddeley and Goodwin. There's some real-world applications for this, a revision and recall of knowledge. However, retrieval cues do not always work.